Instinctively, Catherine chose the outpouring disarray and weakness of a broken woman. The Empress stood before her, enormous, in heavy makeup, with ample bosom and broad hips. She considered Catherine coldly. Catherine fell to her knees at the feet of this statue of reproof and poured out her woe. She was at the end of her rope. No one loved her. Let her be permitted to return to her native land. The Empress, who wept easily, was shaken and furtively wiped her eyes. She asked Catherine to rise. Catherine refused. "How can I send you away?" said the Empress. "Remember that you have children." "My children are in your hands and could not be in better keeping," replied Catherine, still prostrate. "I hope you will not abandon them." "But what can I tell the public to explain why you have been sent away?" "Your Majesty will tell them, if she sees fit, the reasons for which I have incurred your disfavor and the Grand Duke's hatred." "And how will you manage to live? With your relatives? Your mother has fled. She has been obliged to leave her home and has gone to Paris." "I know," sighed Catherine. "She was thought to be too attached to the interests of Russia, and the King of Prussia has persecuted her." Thus, Johanna, and by extension her daughter as well, appeared as martyrs to the Russian cause. Elizabeth, who had not expected this explanation, reflected, softened, stretched out her hand toward the young woman collapsed before her in her pretty dress, made her rise, and murmured, "God is my witness how much I wept after you first came to Russia, when you lay sick almost to death, and if I had not loved you I should not have kept you here." And while Catherine offered profuse thanks for her former kindnesses, which made her present disgrace even more cruel, the Empress drew very near to her and continued, "You are extremely proud. Remember that at the summer palace one day I came up to you and asked if you had a stiff neck, because I saw that you hardly bowed to me, and that it was because of your pride that you merely greeted me with a nod." Catherine protested her faithful humility and adoration, but the other cut her short. "You imagine that no one is cleverer than you." "If I did believe that," groaned Catherine, "nothing would better serve to undeceive me than my present condition and this very conversation, since I see that I have been so stupid that not until this moment have I understood what you were pleased to say to me 4 years ago." Disappointed by the turn the conversation was taking, with questions of wounded pride taking precedence over political considerations, the Grand Duke was whispering with Alexander Shuvalov in his corner. Suddenly he raised his voice and said, "She is fearfully spiteful and stubborn." "If it is of me that you are speaking," cried Catherine, "I am very happy to tell you, in the presence of Her Majesty, that I am indeed spiteful towards those who advise you to act unjustly, and that I have become stubborn since I realized that by being obliging I gain nothing but your enmity." Minute by minute she was growing more assured. Maybe she would get out of it with an ordinary reprimand, just a contretemps between aunt and niece. In any case, the Empress seemed to have forgotten the principal accusation against her, that of treason. She was pacing up and down the room in her great rustling gown. Then suddenly came the frontal attack. "You meddle in many things that do not concern you," said the Tsarina, withering Catherine with a look. "I should never have dared to do that in the time of the Empress Anna. For example, how dare you send orders to Marshal Apraxin?" Catherine started. "I? Never did it enter my head to send him orders." "How can you deny that you wrote to him? Your letters are there in that basin." She pointed to the papers in the gold basin and added, "You are forbidden to write letters." "It is true that I transgressed that order, and I beg your pardon for it," said Catherine, in no wise disconcerted. "But since my letters are there, those 3 letters can prove to your Majesty that I never sent him orders, but that in one I told him what people were saying about his conduct. Of the 2 others, one contains only my congratulations on the birth of his son, and the other my greeting for the new year." "Bestuzhev says that there were many others." Catherine met the Empress's gaze and declared calmly, "If Bestujev says that, he lies." "Very well," exclaimed Elizabeth. "Since he lies about you, I will have him put to torture." Catherine did not turn a hair. She was even half tempted to smile at such a crude attempt to intimidate her. Now she was sure that the evidence collected against her was nonsense. Having given vent to her anger, the Empress was gradually subsiding. The Grand Duke chose this moment to burst out in clumsy attacks on his wife. He sensed that she was on the point of winning the match, and he wanted to reverse the situation. "It was as clear as day," writes Catherine, "that his object was to sweep me aside in order to put his current mistress in my place." Deafened by her nephew's shouting, the Empress showed signs of weariness. In this family quarrel between a gesticulating, bellowing husband and a wife who maintained a dignified silence, her sympathies were decidedly with the wife. She approached Catherine, and with a meaningful glance in the direction of her nephew, said in a low tone, "There are many things I should like to say to you, but I do not want to make things worse between you than they are already." This indication of trust, coming after a hard confrontation, gave Catherine the measure of her victory. "I became all heart," she writes. She whispered in the Empress's ear, "I, too, am unable to speak, in spite of my pressing desire to open my heart and soul to you." Once again the Empress's eyes filled with tears. To hide her emotion, she dismissed Catherine and the Grand Duke, keeping only Alexander Shuvalov with her. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Exhausted and radiant, Catherine was being undressed by her maids when Shuvalov knocked at the door. He came from the Empress, who sent her compliments to the Grand Duchess, begged her not to distress herself any longer, and promised to have a second conversation with her, this time alone. That night, Catherine went to sleep on a cloud. The next day she was told of a remark Her Majesty had made to a courtier. "She, the Grand Duchess, loves truth and justice. She is a woman of great sense, but my nephew is a fool." Notwithstanding these flattering words, Catherine was still waiting for the second conversation promised by Elizabeth. The Empress was lazy and undependable. Could she have suddenly changed her mind? In any case, Peter was as insolent as ever, and the Vorontsova woman was so sure that he would marry her that she did the honors of the Grand Duke's apartment as if she were already installed there as his legitimate wife. Fearing that what she had won in her nocturnal battle might slip away from her as the weeks passed, Catherine began to talk about leaving again. Once again the tactic was successful. An ally of the Grand Duke and one of her worst enemies, Vice-Chancellor Michael Vorontsov, begged her, weeping and wheezing — he had a kind of goiter — to renounce a plan that caused so much sorrow to the Empress. She held her ground. She spoke of her children who were hidden from her. She repeated that everything was done here to ensure that she would have no wish to remain. A few days later she was told that she had permission to see her son and daughter that very afternoon at 3 o'clock, and that after the visit she would be received by Her Majesty. Arriving punctually for the appointment, she found herself before two little strangers who looked at her with cold incomprehension. Paul was 5 years old, Anna only a few months. Catherine played with them inside a circle of nurses and governesses who looked on disapprovingly. To tell the truth, she was not greatly moved. She had brought these two beings into the world for the benefit of another woman. Resigned to a sort of abstract maternity, she thought more about her forthcoming interview with the Empress than about the fresh young faces dancing before her. She was almost impatient to leave them. At last, Alexander Shuvalov told her that the Empress was ready. She hastened to her. The door opened, closed again, and they were alone together, without the smallest screen in the room to hide a witness. At once the Empress posed a condition. "I insist that you tell me the truth about everything I am going to ask you. Catherine swore to open her heart to her without reservation. They spoke of the letters to Apraxin again, of Bestuzhev's betrayal, of the Grand Duke's misconduct. Doubtless also, though Catherine is silent on this point in her memoirs, the Tsarina wanted to know more about her niece's love affairs with Serge Saltykov and Stanislav Poniatowski, about the cooling of her relations with Peter, about the true paternity of Paul and Anna. Note: Catherine broke off the writing of her memoirs in the midst of this scene of her heart-to-heart conversation with Elizabeth. The document comes to an abrupt end in the middle of a sentence. However that may be, following this interview behind closed doors, a sort of modus vivendi was established between the two women, an honourable, lukewarm peace composed of concessions, resignation, and surveillance. Catherine reappeared at court and no longer talked of leaving Russia. The Empress received her very well and gave her more of a welcome than usual, wrote the Marquis de l'Hôpital. She had obtained the right to see her children once a week, which was something she had scarcely dared hope for. They were being brought up in the imperial palace of Peterhof, while she herself lived at the palace of Oranienbaum, 20 versts away. She was no longer caught up in the swirl of politics. Besides, the Bestuzhev affair had fizzled out. The death sentence awaiting the traitorous minister had been set aside. He had merely been exiled to his estates. His accomplices, Bernardi, Ilagin, and Udodjurov, had met a similar fate. Lastly, Stanislav Poniatowski had been expelled from Russia. Catherine received the blow with bitter serenity. She had been expecting it for so long. But in April 1759, a few weeks after her lover's departure, she lost the daughter she had had by him, the little Princess Anna. This sudden disappearance again reduced her to tears. She could count herself lucky that the child had died far from her. She would have been accused of not having taken proper care of her. The following year, it was her mother who died in Paris. The French impounded Johanna's correspondence. Catherine was afraid that certain letters she had sent secretly to the deceased might find their way back to Russia and fall into the hands of the Tsarina. But the Duc de Choiseul took care of the matter and had the compromising documents burned. As for Johanna's pieces of furniture, the many creditors of the Countess of Oldenburg had seized them and were threatening to sell them at auction. The Empress reluctantly consented to pay a few 100,000 francs so as to avoid a scandal. Catherine had a sense of relief, but also a great feeling of loneliness. Now she was isolated, even politically. In the days when Bestuzhev had been directing the affairs of the Empire, she knew that he would support her to the end of the road. Now that he had fallen, she had no one to count on but herself in the daily struggle for the throne. That did not faze her. Her highest trump, she thought, was the Grand Duke's unpopularity. The more he astonished the court with his folly, the better would be her chances of supplanting him. Already the Empress no longer counted. She was near death, and the succession was practically open. Catherine was 30 years old and had a monstrous appetite for power and love. Sometimes it seemed to her that she had not yet begun to live. Love, gathering darkness, perfidy. Far from the salons where Catherine was trying to rally a few supporters, the war went on, violent, murderous, and of doubtful outcome. The Russians, under command of General Fermor, had occupied Königsberg in January 1758, and on August the 25th of the same year, at Zorndorf, they engaged in a battle at once so bloody and so indecisive that each of the sides considered itself victorious and offered thanks with Te Deums. The following year, Frederick was beaten by the Russians at Kunersdorf, and the Austrians occupied Saxony. Frederick immediately regrouped his forces, and in August 1760 was victorious at the Battle of Liegnitz. true. 2 months later, the Austrians and Russians entered Berlin. But shortly thereafter, they were forced to evacuate the city. At Torgau, there was another Prussian victory. At the Empress's court, these renewed signs of strength on the part of an enemy who was thought to be on his knees aroused a mixture of chagrin and admiration. How could one fail to respect the fighting spirit of a king who refused to strike his colours before a coalition of 3 great powers? But the attitude among middle-ranking officers, most of whom came from a nobility steeped in patriotic traditions, was very different from the one that reigned at the palace. The court, with its diplomats, foreign visitors, and family connections beyond the borders, was an environment subject to outside influences. Among the courtiers, it was fashionable to lend an ear to what was being said in Europe. One took pride in having an open mind. In army ranks, on the other hand, the important thing was to be Russian. Many officers made no secret of their indignation that, in the midst of a war, certain highly placed personages in the empire showed open sympathy for the Prussian cause. There were some who even went so far as to insinuate that the Grand Duke, whose worship of Frederick was common knowledge, was betraying Russia and passing along information to the man he called the King, my master. And in fact, Peter, obsessed with his idol, had only one thought in mind: to transmit to him everything that was said at the secret meetings of the Empress's Council of War. It was the new ambassador from England, Keith, who received this information and communicated it as quickly as possible to Frederick. In this way, the King of Prussia was informed of Russian troop movements even before the chief interested parties were advised of them. Of course, the Grand Duke received some money in exchange for his services, but he would unquestionably have done as much for nothing. During the summer of 1759, he became deeply interested in the fate of a Prussian officer who had been taken prisoner at the Battle of Zorndorf, Count Scherin, an aide-de-camp to the King of Prussia. The Russians treated this distinguished captive like a noble traveller passing through the capital. It was an honor for everyone to receive and to entertain him. "If I were emperor, you would never be a prisoner of war," Peter told him in an outburst of feeling, and he installed him in a house in St. Petersburg, not far from the imperial palace. 2 Russian officers were assigned to the celebrated prisoner, not so much to guard him as to keep him company. One of them was a young lieutenant, Gregory Orloff, who was a hero of that same battle at Zorndorf. Wounded 3 times, he had remained deaf to the exhortations of those around him, and had continued to fight with even greater spirit at the head of his men. To reward him, and to give him a rest, his superiors had sent him to St. Petersburg as Count Scherin's bodyguard. Gregory Orloff spent most of his time resting over the gaming tables, in taverns, and in bed with whores. But that did not mean that he disdained ladies of high society. For example, he seduced and wooed away the beautiful Helen Kurakina, mistress of his superior, General Peter Shuvalov. Note, Peter Shuvalov was the cousin of the Empress's favorite, Ivan Shuvalov. The risk he took in so doing, whether it was inspired by passion or bravado, sent a thrill through every feminine heart. His prowess as a lover gave added luster to his prowess as a soldier. People said he was mad, and admired him. It was expected that Peter Shuvalov would break the career of the presumptuous lieutenant. But the young man was born under a lucky star. The general died suddenly before he was able to avenge his honor. Women cried it was a miracle, men frowned. To the former, Gregory Orloff was a force of nature. To the latter, he was a carouser and brawler who should be punished for his misconduct as an example. Catherine, in her semi-retirement, followed the capers of this spirited colt with amusement. There were 5 Orloff brothers in the regiments of the Guard: Ivan, Gregory, Alexis, Fyodor, and Vladimir. Of the 5, Gregory, The second was certainly the most charming. Very tall, with an athletic build and regular features, he carried his head high. The gentleness and refinement of his face were in curious contrast with the impression of power given by his body. This formidable colossus had velvet eyes and an almost feminine smile. He was certainly handsomer than Stanislav Poniatowski, whose departure had caused Catherine a certain amount of grief, and even handsomer than Serge Soltykov. But he had only a mediocre mind and very little education. He came of a modest background. His grandfather, a simple soldier, had been compromised in 1689 during the revolt of the Streltsy. Note, regiments of the standing Muscovite army. Condemned to death and taken to the place of execution, he had calmly kicked aside the bloody head of a companion decapitated before him and advanced toward the block. Moved to admiration by so much offhand coolness, Peter the Great had decided to pardon him. The culprit had been taken into the regular army, where he served the Tsar faithfully and was promoted to an officer's rank. His son, Gregory Ivanovich, became the governor of Novgorod, and at the age of 53 married a noble damsel by the name of Zinoviev, who bore him 9 sons, of whom 5 survived. These 5 offspring of heroic proportions were the 5 Orlov brothers, and their exploits were the talk of the court and the town. United like the fingers of the same hand, they made a joyous band in which mutual trust and assistance were the rule. Limited in intelligence and vigorously healthy, they had in common a sense of honor, love for their regiments and a taste for the bottle, cards, and women. Their men idolized them for their spontaneous courage and their free and easy ways. They were kings of the barracks. And at court they turned more than one head. One evening, Gregory Orlov, having accompanied his prisoner Shirin to a reception of the Grand Dukes, happened to be on guard at the palace. Catherine, who had just had a painful scene with her husband, rushed to her window in tears for a breath of fresh air, and discovered below her a giant with the face of an archangel. He glanced up with a look of respectful admiration. She melted on the spot, and from that time forth thought of nothing but making the acquaintance of this man whom heaven had sent to console her. Note: neither the 2 principals nor those close to them have left any record of the beginning of the relations between Catherine and Gregory Orlov. This episode, which has come down to us through oral tradition, is set down in particular by Helbig in Russische Günstlinge. Obviously, he was not of high enough birth to be admitted to court in the Grand Duchess's circle, like Serge Soltykov or Stanislav Poniatowski or even Zaha Chernyshев. Catherine knew only too well how eager her enemies were to blacken her name, and she was not willing to risk receiving an admirer of such dubious reputation in her own apartments. She therefore asked her friend Countess Praskovia Bruce to arrange for them to meet outside in a little house on an island in the Neva, the Vasily Ostrov. From the beginning they seemed to be in perfect harmony. How was it that this woman, who had a keen mind and read Montesquieu and Voltaire with fascination, found so much pleasure in the company of a trooper with a noble brow and the mind of a child? She was 30, an age which at the time represented the full flower of maturity for a woman, and he was 25. With him she could have none of those half-sentimental, half-intellectual conversations in which she ordinarily delighted. But he held her with the warmth of his skin, the vigor of his loins. Catherine possessed a simple, healthy sensuality. She would greedily enjoy Gregory Orlov's caresses, and, back in the palace, secretly write very affectionate letters to Stanislav Poniatowski, the inconsolable exile, who was conversant with the great minds, and was the only man who could understand all the nuances of her feelings. Ah, if only she could have both of them near her. Another consideration This one, purely political, also bound Catherine to the handsome Gregory. To her, he and his brothers were the embodiment of the Russian army. When she rested on her lover's breast, she was leaning on the regiments of the Guard. How could she forget that the present Empress had been borne to the throne by the enthusiasm of the soldiers? It was even said that she used to get them drunk so as to win them to her cause. Catherine would not go that far, but she realized very quickly that she would do better to count on the devotion of these junior officers who were Russian through and through than to try to gain the sympathy of a high command that was subject to all the intrigues of the court. Thus, by sleeping with Gregory Orloff, she both obtained personal satisfaction and also established the basis for a possible coup d'etat. The affair was justified by pleasure and reason in equal measure. As for Gregory Orloff, he was living in a dream. Princess Helen Kurakina had been supplanted at once. True, Catherine was no longer in the first bloom of youth, but the nearby throne shed a supernatural light upon her. Her rank made her more youthful, more beautiful, more desirable. The outrageous treatment she received at the hands of a husband who had sold out to Germany made it a duty for any man of spirit to protect her. 100 times she had shown her love for Russia, her devotion to the Orthodox faith, and her respect for the traditions of the army. The whole Orloff clan was proud that she had singled out one of their number. The 5 brothers were ready to place their swords at her service. Meantime, they did propaganda work on her behalf among their fellow officers. Alexis, the third of the Orloff brothers, seemed even more firmly resolved than Gregory to put the enemies of the Grand Duchess to rout. Not so handsome as his older brother, Alexis was nicknamed Scarface and had a great scar running from ear to mouth, the souvenir of a sword cut received during a tavern brawl. His appearance was nonetheless dashing. Capable of felling an ox with the blow of his fist, he was not only physically strong, but intelligent, cynical, and ambitious. He was made of sterner stuff than Gregory, but he was, first of all, a man of action rather than a politician, and Catherine was a little afraid of his impetuosity and violence. If she was to succeed, she must be able to rely on both strength, the Orloffs, the army, and cunning, alliances at court. She had lost a great deal with the fall of Bestuzhev. The old statesman, experienced in public affairs, had been a wise counsellor to her. Fortunately, a friend of the disgraced Chancellor had remained in favour with the Empress, Count Nikita Panin. Panin had received his political training from Bestuzhev. He was a cultivated man with noble manners, a liberal outlook, a taste for a dainty table, and an eye for a pretty woman. 10 years earlier, Bestuzhev had even thought of him as a candidate for the post of Empress's favourite. But Panin had fallen asleep outside the sovereign's dressing room instead of strutting in at the propitious moment like a triumphant rooster. Having been sent on mission first to Copenhagen, then to Stockholm, he was recalled to St. Petersburg by Elizabeth in 1760. The Tsarina, disappointed and grown old, had no thought now of using him to replace the indefatigable Ivan Shuvalov. However, she entrusted him with the post of tutor to the Tsarevich Paul. Catherine immediately drew closer to Panin. Their political ideas coincided on certain points. Like her, he was opposed to the Grand Duke's Prussian tendencies. Like her, he believed that when the Empress died, Peter must not be allowed to succeed. But his plan was to have little Paul ascend the throne, assisted by a council of regents headed by Catherine, while she saw no reason why her son should be proclaimed emperor when she herself was ready to exercise complete power. While Catherine and Panin consulted in secret, the Vorontsovs concocted a different scenario. The crown would fall to Peter, who would divorce Catherine at once, denounce the illegitimacy of little Paul, and marry their relative, the lady-in-waiting Elizabeth Vorontsova. The Grand Duke, moreover, was entirely in favor of this solution. He was obsessed with two thoughts. First, to put an immediate end to the war against Prussia. Second, to marry his mistress. Of course, Catherine and the bastard would first have to be swept out of sight. He made no secret of his intentions. His hunchbacked, squint-eyed favourite, whom Catherine mockingly called Madame Pompadour, behaved as if she were his legitimate wife. She moved about the Grand Duchess's own salons as if she were in conquered territory. The walls, the furniture, belonged to her. There were those who sought her support, foreseeing future upheavals. Convinced that he was at last loved for himself, Peter found his companion's ugliness and coarseness additional reasons for cherishing her and asserting her rights. And the more attached to her he became through passion and political interest, the more he detested the woman whose mere presence was an obstacle to their happiness. But he could not get rid of Catherine until the Empress died, and Elizabeth, at 50, weak and worn out, clung desperately to life. Bloated with fat, her legs swollen, short of breath, she refused to take care of herself, ate and drank until she was ready to burst, and spent hours in prayer. Sometimes she would be roused by news of the war, would swear to pursue it to victory and to remain faithful to her allies. Then she would fall into a stupor, and it would be impossible to get her to sign a paper. Important dispatches lay forgotten on her table. She shivered with cold. Her young lover's caresses were no longer enough to warm her. Besides, Ivan Shuvalov was so aware that his prerogatives as favourite would soon come to an end that he was already looking for another protectress. All at once, after having fought Catherine, he began to court her assiduously. It was perfectly clear that he would have no objection to moving from the Empress's bed to the Grand Duchess's. He knew that so far as pleasure was concerned it would be a change for the better. But he also believed, unlike the Vorontsovs, that when Her Majesty died the young woman would become, if not Tsarina herself, at least regent, and for a long time, since little Paul was only 6. By temperament, Ivan Shuvalov needed to be near the sun. Catherine saw through his game, was amused by it, and did not discourage him. Having him for an ally, along with the Orloffs and Panin, could further strengthen her position vis-à-vis the Grand Duke. Suddenly she acquired another supporter, one even more surprising perhaps than Ivan Shuvalov, Catherine Dashkova, née Vorontsova, the sister of the Grand Duke's mistress. Recently married to Prince Dashkov, this very young woman, she was only 17, had broken openly with her family and fallen under Catherine's spell. The more her sisters, father and uncles criticized the Grand Duchess, the more she admired her. Prodigiously cultivated, Princess Dashkova spoke only French, was passionately interested in art, literature and philosophy, and had a very lively mind that compensated for her lack of physical attractions. The great French encyclopedist Diderot, who was to meet her a few years later and be dazzled by her brilliant conversation, describes her as follows. She is short, she has a broad, high forehead, big puffy cheeks, eyes that are neither large nor small, set rather deep in their sockets, black eyebrows and hair, a flat nose, a large mouth, thick lips, bad teeth, a round, straight neck such as her compatriots commonly have, no waist whatever, quick movements, few graces, no nobility. Every Sunday during the summer of 1761, after having visited her son at Peterhof, Catherine would stop on the way back at Princess Dashkova's house. They would leave together for Oranienbaum and spend the rest of the day in the palace, discussing grave scientific, artistic or social problems. Catherine was later to find her exasperatingly conceited, confused and demanding, but for the time being Princess Dashkova made a marvelous interlocutor for her, full of a miscellaneous assortment of knowledge picked up from books, quick to defend good causes, and with qualities of mind and heart very like her own. Finding it impossible to have an elevated conversation with the handsome Gregory Orloff, she made up for it with this child. But, curiously enough, the athletic lover and frail friend had one trait in common: a fiery spirit, a taste for danger and excitement, for taking a chance, making a leap into the unknown. Catherine, who never lost her bearings, had to preach moderation to them both to keep them from compromising her. One night, in December 1761, learning that the Empress was at death's door, Princess Dashkova, who was herself suffering from a bad cold, got out of bed with feverish decision, muffled herself up in furs, and had herself driven to the wooden palace on the Moika Canal, where the imperial family was in residence. She ran through the snow to the vestibule and wandered blindly through dark corridors and unfamiliar rooms. Just when she despaired of finding her way, she met a chambermaid who agreed to take her to the Grand Duchess. Catherine, who was in bed, scolded her visitor for her imprudence, insisted that she climb into bed to get warm, wrapped her in blankets, clasped her arms around her. "Madame," whispered the shivering princess, "in the present state of affairs, when the Empress has only a few days, perhaps only a few hours to live, I can no longer bear to think of the uncertainty in which the coming event will place your interests. Have you formed a plan, or provided for your safety? I beg you to give me your orders and direct me." Touched by so much devotion, Catherine batted her eyes, pressed her friend's burning hand against her breast, and enjoined her to remain calm. She, who for years had envisaged every possible solution, and who only recently had outlined her plan of action in a letter to Hanbury Williams, pretended to be disinterested and prepared to submit to fate. "My beloved princess," she said sadly, "I am more grateful to you than I can express, but I have formed no kind of plan. I shall undertake nothing, and I believe that the only thing left for me to do is to accept courageously events as they occur. Thus I place myself in the hands of the Almighty, and it is in His protection that I repose my only hope." "Then, madame," exclaimed the princess, "your friends must act for you. As for me, I have zeal enough to inflame them all." A consummate actress, Catherine persisted in her angelic obstinacy, and kissing her fierce ally, she murmured, "In the name of heaven, princess, do not think of exposing yourself to danger in the hope of curing ills for which there is in fact no remedy." These words of wisdom were disappointing to Princess Dashkova. She accused Catherine of losing her nerve just when she was on the verge of attaining her goal. But it was not weakness of character that made Catherine refuse to act. At this time she was pregnant by Gregory Orloff, and was afraid Peter would discover her condition and use it as a pretext to repudiate her officially. In the face of such a scandal, no one would dare to come to her defense. She would be definitively and ignominiously cut off from the throne, all because of the stupid fetus she was carrying in her womb. She was in her 5th month, wearing loose dresses to hide her shape, telling everyone that she was tired, keeping to her room, receiving almost no one, and this harebrained girl came to summon her to combat. No, she must wait for a better moment, after the birth of the baby, which she would arrange to keep a secret. If only the Empress held on until then. At court, everyone was plotting, Russians and foreigners alike. The death of the Tsarina was at the center of every calculation. The ambassadors were constantly sending coded messages to their governments, each making his own prediction. Who would reign? Peter? Paul? Catherine? Would they witness a palace revolution like the one that had carried Elizabeth to the throne? Baron de Breteuil, the French ambassador, wrote, "When I consider the nation's hatred for the Grand Duke and the excesses of that prince, I am tempted to foresee the most complete revolution on the death of the Empress." But when I turn my attention to the base and pusillanimous nature of the persons who are in a position to throw off all disguise, I see fear and servile obedience triumphing as calmly as when the Empress, Elizabeth, usurped the throne. On December the 23rd, 1761, the Empress had an attack and, her strength all but exhausted, received extreme unction in the presence of the Grand Duke and Duchess. After having whispered twice over the prayer for the dying, she asked those around her to forgive her her trespasses. On her knees in the midst of the sinister pomp of the Empress's bedchamber, tapers burning, priests in chasubles of mourning, venerable monks in tall black coifs, funereal chants, sighing courtiers and ladies in waiting, Catherine wept for the enigmatic woman of whom she still did not know what to think. Was Elizabeth her enemy or her friend? The Grand Duke was a marble statue. As for the principal dignitaries, each was secretly thinking about the repercussions this death would have upon his own life. 2 days later, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Day, Nikita Trubetskoy emerged from the Empress's room and, with a grave face and trembling voice, declared to the persons assembled that Her Majesty Elizabeth had ordered them to live a long time. Note, on December the 25th, 1761, according to the Julian calendar, that is, January the 5th, 1762, by the Gregorian calendar. This was the phrase traditionally used in Russia to announce someone's death, whether prince or peasant. Then, while sobs burst forth at the sad news, Nikita Trubetskoy proclaimed the advent of the Emperor Peter III. Despair at once gave way to joy. The courtiers rushed to prostrate themselves and kiss the hands of their new master. Catherine was forgotten. No doubt she had even lost the whole match. Baron de Breteuil was right. Despite the fact that he was universally disliked, Peter could count on the abject obedience of a people and a court that his grandfather, Peter the Great, had beaten into submission. The reign of Peter III. Embalmed, enormous, her body stiffly robed in a dress of cloth of silver, a gold crown on her head, the Empress Elizabeth lay in state for 6 weeks in the Winter Palace, watched over by ladies of the court and officers of the guard. Then she was transported to the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, where she remained for 10 days. The weeping populace filed by the monumental catafalque. The weeping populace filed by the monumental catafalque. She lay there with her hands clasped, her painted face an impassive mask. To the common people, she was the daughter of Peter the Great. They knew nothing about her extravagance, her violence, her lechery and incompetence. There was so much gold, so many precious stones, and so many candles around her coffin. She must have been a powerful sovereign, a real Russian, and to think that her successor was a German. According to custom, the nobility, the clergy, the army, and representatives of the bourgeoisie and craftsmen's guild had sworn fealty to the new emperor. Peter III had only contempt for the nation whose leadership he had assumed. He made no secret of his hatred for the deceased and the sacrilegious joy he felt at being rid of her supervision. Suddenly, after having been tied so long to someone's apron strings, he could do anything he liked. His newfound freedom intoxicated him. In defiance of the country's sorrow, he refused to stand vigil over the body, and on those rare occasions when he approached the coffin, it was with the deliberate intention of shocking those present. He would talk in a loud voice, jest, make faces, mock the priests. Courtiers who wished to please him had to attend dinners and performances organized in his apartments without the least concern for Russia's mourning. It was forbidden to wear black at these gatherings. Everyone had to dress as for a gala occasion, and drink and laugh and sing. Catherine herself was sometimes obliged to appear at these festivities in a ball gown. She made up for it by demonstrating an exemplary piety the rest of the time. During the 10 days the Empress's corpse remained on display under the nave, she spent hours in prayers and tears at the foot of the catafalque, shrouded in black veils from head to foot. She undertook this tedious exercise not so much out of love for the deceased as out of concern for her own public image. The crowds that filed by to do homage to the dead Empress, a mixture of all classes, bourgeois, workers, peasants, merchants, soldiers, priests, beggars, also saw the living Empress, grief-stricken, without crown, without jewels, amid the tapers and icons. This religious pomp gave Catherine a kind of Russian authenticity in their eyes. Crossing herself and genuflecting, she was a woman of their own race. Had she opened her mouth, they would have been greatly surprised to hear her German accent. Catherine was aware of this human river that flowed so near to her in the semi-darkness, and she had an almost physical sense of the sympathy her attitude aroused. "The Empress is gaining ground in the minds of all," wrote Baron de Breteuil, Minister Plenipotentiary of France. "No one is more assiduous in the performance of the duties due to the late Empress, which, in accordance with Greek religion, are numerous and full of superstitions that she surely finds laughable, but the clergy and the people believe her to be deeply affected and are grateful to her on that account. With an exactitude remarkable to those who know her, she observes saints' days, fasts, days of abstinence, all of which the Emperor treats lightly and which are nevertheless of no small importance in this country. She is not the woman to forget or forgive the threat often uttered by the Emperor when he was Grand Duke, to have her head shaved and shut her up in a convent, as Peter I did to his first wife. All that, together with her daily humiliations, must be in a ferment in a mind like hers, and wants only an opportunity to explode." On the day of the funeral, Peter added one last straw to his insolence by clowning his way through the funeral procession. Every now and then he would start to run after the coffin, forcing the dignitaries who bore the long train of his mourning cloak to let go. The black cloth would flap in the wind behind him, to his great amusement. Then he would stop and let the old courtiers catch up with him, this time disrupting the cortege by marking time in place. Several times during the funeral service he broke out laughing, stuck his tongue out, and talked in a loud voice, interrupting the priests. It was as if he were deliberately doing everything imaginable to fan his subjects' hatred. Perhaps he was hypnotized by the idea of his own omnipotence, or blinded by the memory of the extravagancies of Peter the Great and Elizabeth. Or perhaps he was in the grip of a fatal fascination, like a man standing on the brink of a precipice. Each day he was driven by a kind of inner necessity to lean farther over the edge of the abyss that would swallow him up. From that time forth, every word he uttered, every gesture he made, contributed to his ruin. In the very night following the accession, he sent courtiers to all units of the army with the order to cease hostilities. The troops conducting joint operations with the Austrians were to leave them immediately. Those who were occupying eastern Prussia, Pomerania, and Brandenburg were to evacuate those territories. The city of Kolberg, which had just been taken, was to be returned. At the same time, Peter sent a personal letter to Frederick, assuring him of his admiration and friendship. The King of Prussia, who already thought himself lost, was exultant. For him and his army, this was an unlooked-for rescue. A madman was bringing him victory on a silver platter. On April the 24th, 1762, violating the Senate's commitment not to conclude a separate peace, the Emperor of Russia signed a treaty with Frederick providing not only that all occupied territories would be restored to him, but also that Russian troops would join Prussian forces to fight the Austrians, their allies of yesterday. Peter wore on his finger a ring in which was set a portrait of his idol, which he would kiss fervently at every opportunity. He affected only one decoration, the Order of the Black Eagle of Prussia. Drowned in wine, unable to stand upright or articulate his words, he stammered drunkenly to the Prussian minister, "Let us drink to the health of your king, our master. He has been so kind as to entrust me with one of his regiments. I hope he will not dismiss me. You can assure him that, if he gives the order, I will make war on hell with my whole empire." The English ambassador reported to his government in code that His Imperial Majesty's passion for the King of Prussia was beyond expression. Not content with having alienated the army by this shameful about-face which had all the earmarks of a betrayal, Peter tried to impose Prussian discipline upon it, and even the Prussian uniform. But while the officers were willing enough in those days to change adversaries for political reasons, they had a very strong esprit de corps and an even stronger respect for military tradition. By dressing his soldiers as Germans, the Tsar insulted them. By subjecting them to Frederick's code, he ran counter to everything they were used to. Under the preceding reign they might have been sentenced to run the gauntlet for a peccadillo. They would return to the ranks with a flayed back and a rugged good humour. Now they grumbled because they were made to repeat drills that were not executed with the precision of a company of robots. Carried away by his passion for everything German, Peter dissolved the regiment of bodyguards and replaced it with a Holstein regiment. He named Prince George of Holstein commander of the Russian armies and placed him at the head of the Horse Guard, an elite unit that had never had any colonel but the sovereign himself. To give himself the illusion of living in a permanent state of warfare, he ordered constant salvos of artillery. From morning till night, St. Petersburg was shaken by the thunder of cannon fire. The inhabitants' ears were deafened, their nerves frayed. Rullière, who was an attaché with the French embassy at the time, wrote that the noise in Peter's peaceful capital was like that in a city under siege. One day he wanted to hear a single shot fired by 100 big guns at the same time, and gave the order for it. He could be dissuaded from carrying out his whim only when it was pointed out to him that it would make the city fall to pieces. Often he would rise from table to throw himself on his knees, with a glass in his hand, before the portrait of the King of Prussia, exclaiming, "My brother, we will conquer the universe together." He had taken that prince's envoy into singular favour. He wanted this envoy to have all the young women at court. He would shut him up in a room with them and stand guard at the door with a naked sword in his hand. Having thoroughly shaken up the army, Peter turned on the church. Although baptized Greek Orthodox out of necessity, in his heart he remained a Lutheran. The faith that his subjects professed seemed to him a jumble of idiotic legends and barbarous superstitions. It was his duty as a European to blow the dust off all that. Despite Frederick's urgings, he had not yet had himself consecrated emperor in Moscow, and consequently was not yet officially head of the church. But he would just like to see this mitred rabble try to oppose him. In his concern for progress, he decreed that all sacred images, with the exception of those of Christ and the Virgin, be removed from places of prayer. He planned to replace the priests' cassocks with the frock coats worn by Lutheran pastors, and to force the clergy to shave their beards. He had a Lutheran chapel built in his palace, and personally attended the religious ceremonies held there. He proclaimed that Protestants had equal rights to practice their religion, and decreed more tolerance towards the Russian heretics, especially the old believers. Lastly, and most importantly, he dared to order the confiscation of the wealth of the church. In so doing, he attacked the Holy of Holies. The Russian church was very rich and very powerful. Although it owned vast domains inhabited by what were possibly the worst treated serfs in the empire, it paid no taxes to the state. Its influence over the people ran so deep that no ruler had yet dared to oppose it. Whoever defied the Church defied God. Whoever laid his hand on its treasure stole from God. Faced with the UK's providing for the secularization of a part of the wealth of the monasteries, the bishops expressed indignation, the popes vituperated. The new emperor was a heretic, a Lutheran, the Antichrist in person. Riots broke out in the countryside. There is a public outcry of discontent, noted Baron de Breteuil in a dispatch of June the 18th, 1762. Yet in this avalanche of ukases there was one that was favourably received. With the stroke of the pen, Peter abolished the office of the political police, or secret chancery, which the British ambassador Keith had described as an abominable court, more cruel and tyrannical than the Spanish Inquisition. Many persons close to the throne breathed a sigh of relief. But above all, the aristocracy appreciated the Manifesto on the Immunities of the Nobility, promulgated by the Tsar, which exempted nobles from military service except in time of war, authorized them to travel abroad, and strengthened their rights over the serfs. The satisfaction of the great Russian families was short-lived. Peter had recalled from Siberia the dignitaries exiled by Elizabeth: Byron, Munich, Lestock, the sons of Osterman. Once again he was surrounded by German advisers. Most of them urged him to execute his open enemies. He hesitated. He did not have in him the cruel decisiveness of true aristocrats, for whom torture and murder are the necessary auxiliaries of politics. If he was sadistic, it was in small things. He liked to offend people, mock them, wound them, not kill them. One day he took it into his head to make all dignitaries divorce their wives and then remarry the women he would choose for them. Then another idea crossed his mind, and he forgot this preposterous plan. Dazzled by the example of the King of Prussia, he too wanted to distinguish himself in the battlefield. After so many tabletop battles with soldiers made of starch, he must have real fights with real soldiers on real terrain. Hardly had he proclaimed his will for general peace than he decided to declare war on Denmark in order to reconquer his hereditary province of Schleswig, a territory Russia did not need in the least. Frederick, disturbed by this whim of Peter's, tried in vain to discourage him. Though the treasury was almost dry and the military were furious at having been deprived of certain victory over Prussia, Peter ordered the army and navy to make ready. While Peter filled himself with dreams, Catherine still affected grief, piety, and resignation. She had good reason for leading a discreet life. Her pregnancy, which she continued to hide from all eyes, especially those of her husband. Thinking to humiliate her, he confined her to her apartments located at one end of the new Winter Palace, while he installed himself at the other end with Elizabeth Vorontsova. This arrangement offered Catherine the freedom of movement she needed. Elizabeth Vorontsova beamed with satisfaction, as did the whole Vorontsov clan. Peter had named her, to begin with, Grand Mistress of the Court. This new distinction did nothing to increase her charm or dignity. "She has a dull mind," wrote Baron de Breteuil in January 1762. "As for her face, it is the worst possible. In all respects she resembles an inn-servant of the lower sort." The German, Scherer, judged her even more harshly. "She swore like a trooper, had a squint, stank, and spat when she talked." It was also said that she beat the emperor and got drunk with him, and that this violence and disorder were much to his liking. If he could manage to have a male child by a mistress, many people believed that he would make her his wife and the child his successor, wrote Baron de Breteuil on February the 15th, 1762. But the epithets that Mademoiselle Vorontsova has applied to him in public when they have quarrelled are very reassuring in this respect. The unanimous opinion was that Peter was sterile, though not impotent. In any case, he never missed an opportunity to ridicule Catherine in front of the woman who, in his mind, was soon to replace her as empress. On January the 18th, 1762, de Breteaux wrote to the Duc de Choiseul, "The empress is in the most cruel situation and is treated with the most marked contempt. I have told you, Monseigneur, that she sought to fortify herself with philosophy, and I have said how ill this nourishment consorted with her character. I have learned since, beyond any doubt, that she is already very impatient of the Emperor's conduct towards her and of the arrogance of Mademoiselle Vorontsova. Knowing as I do the courage and violence of this princess, I cannot imagine that she will not sooner or later be moved to some extreme. I know that she has certain friends who are trying to calm her, but who would risk everything for her if she required it." On February the 10th, 1762, during the festivities organized to celebrate his birthday, Peter ordered his wife to bestow upon his mistress the insignia of St. Catherine, which was reserved for Tsarinas and wives of heirs to the throne. Catherine herself had received this distinction only after having been officially designated the Grand Duke's betrothed. It was clear that by this gesture Peter wanted to publicly affirm his intention of repudiating the present empress in favor of Elizabeth Vorontsova. Catherine, her stomach squeezed in to hide her pregnancy, mastered her feelings and did as she was bidden without a murmur. It was the only course open to her, since the child already stirring in her womb condemned her to take the defensive. Her calm and noble attitude won her the sympathy of those who were ignorant of the true reasons for it. Her first concern now was to give birth in the palace without arousing the suspicions of the courtiers, who were always eager to destroy a reputation. Too many comings and goings, a cry of pain, the wailing of the newborn infant or a servant's gossip, and all was lost. As the fatal date drew near, Catherine gave out that she had sprained her ankle and could not leave her room. There she received her friends, in bed or wearing a peignoir, with her foot bandaged up and her face tired and drawn. She was cared for by only one trusted and experienced maid, but she could also count on her valet, Chicurin, who would have laid down his life for her. Once she took him into her confidence, he devised a bold stratagem to draw the emperor away. As soon as Catherine was about to give birth, Chicurin would hurry to the little house he owned at some distance from the palace and set fire to it. The emperor, who loved fires, would rush to the spot with his mistress, as he always did. Chicurin would see to it that they were kept watching the conflagration as long as necessary. Catherine agreed to the plan, and on the evening of April the 11th, as soon as she felt the first pains, Chicurin put his house to the torch. The fire quickly spread from the little shanty to the whole quarter. Informed of this, Peter and Elizabeth Vorontsova, who were already preparing to retire, hastily got dressed again and hurried to the spot to enjoy the spectacle, followed by a crowd of courtiers. While the emperor excitedly shouted orders and oaths and laid about him with a cudgel, Catherine, with the assistance of her servant, gave birth to a son. No sooner had he been washed and swaddled than the infant was taken from his mother by Chicurin, who carried him off, rolled up in a beaver blanket, to the arms of a waiting female relative. Note: this illegitimate child, baptized Alexis, was to become Count Bobrinsky and to found one of the greatest families in Russia. The name Bobrinsky comes from the Russian word bobry, or beaver. Once again, Catherine had barely caught a glimpse of the child she had just brought into the world, but she had avoided a scandal, and the immense relief she felt consoled her for any disappointment. She was on her feet again soon, cured of her sprain. The diplomats congratulated her on her happy recovery. Roulier was dazzled. "Her figure is pleasing and noble," he wrote. "Her bearing is proud, her person and demeanour full of grace. She has the air of a sovereign, a broad and open forehead, a fresh mouth enhanced by the teeth, brown eyes, very fine, in which the play of light brings out shades of blue. Pride is the chief characteristic of her physiognomy. Her attractiveness is the result of an extreme desire to please and to charm. The Austrian ambassador, Mercy d'Artignan, wrote to the Empress Maria Theresa, "It is hardly possible that, under her calm exterior, she is not concealing some secret enterprise." When he complimented Catherine on looking so well, she answered with a mysterious smile, "You cannot imagine, monsieur, how much it costs a woman to be beautiful." Peter, however, was not to be disarmed. He took every opportunity to undermine the prestige of the woman whom he could not forgive for still being his wife. On June the 9th, 1762, he gave a dinner for 400 guests to celebrate the ratification of the peace treaty with Prussia. For this occasion he had donned the Prussian uniform and wore the Order of the Black Eagle. Whether they liked it or not, the Russian officers would have to drink to the glory of Frederick II. But before delivering this toast, Peter proposed one to the health of the imperial family. All 400 guests rose, pushing back their chairs. At the other end of the head table, Catherine remained seated, as was correct. Hardly had she set down her glass when the Emperor told his aide-de-camp Godovich to go to her and ask her why she had not risen like the others. She replied that it was not for her to rise, since she was a member of the imperial family. Irritated by this clarification, Peter sent the officer back once again with orders to tell the Empress she was a fool. Then, doubtless afraid that Godovich would soften his message out of respect for Her Majesty, he shouted across the table, "Fool! Dura!" shooting a look of hatred at his wife. The word resounded like a slap in the general silence. Everyone had heard it. Peter added immediately that the only members of the imperial family whose presence he recognized in that hall were himself and his uncles, the 2 princes of Holstein. It was a first step towards repudiation, a public proclamation that Catherine had ceased to be both wife and empress in his eyes. Under the shock of this senseless insult, Catherine could not hold back her tears, and turning toward her immediate neighbor, Count Stroganov, asked him to tell her an amusing story. Razumovsky and Baron de Breteuil joined in with lively conversation, trying to dissipate the Empress's discomfiture. Finally, she regained her composure and smiled. After a moment's stupefaction, the company came to life again. Affectionate glances converged on the unjustly insulted Tsarina. Thinking to strike her down, Peter had unwittingly served her cause. That very evening, out of spite, he had Count Stroganov exiled to his estates for having too eagerly comforted his imperial dinner companion. 4 days later he gave the order for Catherine to be imprisoned in the fortress of Schusselburg. His uncle, Prince George of Holstein, begged him to give up this extreme measure, which might arouse the indignation of the army and part of the nobility. Peter reluctantly gave in, but Catherine had already been warned of the plan. She knew now that there were only 2 alternatives before her, the throne or prison, and perhaps death. Peter III's barbarous, senseless ferocity made it seem quite possible that he intended to eliminate his wife, Bérenger, the French chargé d'affaires, wrote afterward. As the danger became clearer, Catherine's friends began to consider more seriously the possibility of a palace revolution. Princess Dashkova, as imprudent as possible, although courageous, in the words of Bérenger, was busy trying to convert a few officers who frequented the salons. The 5 Orloff brothers were recruiting supporters among the young officers of the guard. Gregory, having been appointed paymaster of the artillery unit, was dipping freely into the chest and had succeeded in bribing some 100 soldiers. In the Preobrazhensky regiment, Officers Pasek and Brydykin were fervent admirers of Catherine. In the Izmailovsky regiment they could count on Roslavslev and Lasunsky. Of course, there were also the hetman Cyril Razumovsky, the wise Panin, and a few lesser lights. Was that enough to overthrow an emperor who was the grandson of Peter the Great in favor of a princess who had not a drop of Russian blood in her veins? No, they must have a great deal more money to buy a great many more people. Catherine secretly sent a request for funds to Louis XV's ambassador, Baron de Breteuil. This brilliant young diplomat had originally been sent to Russia with the hope that his dashing appearance would win him Catherine's favours. But when he had presented himself, the post was already filled. Moreover, the Duke de Choiseul had most unwisely allowed him to take with him his wife, a pretty woman who had no intention of letting herself be deceived, even for political reasons. Relations between Breteuil and the Empress were never to go beyond the limits of courtesy, but she responded to his quick mind and fine manners, and sensed that he was in sympathy with her, and it was to him that she turned for an immediate loan of 60,000 roubles. Following the instructions of the Duke de Choiseul not to compromise France, Breteuil was evasive. He avoided giving a definite answer and left St. Petersburg for Warsaw, then Vienna, leaving his chargé d'affaires, Bérenger, to deal with the situation. A few days later, Catherine, disappointed and indignant at the diplomat's lack of understanding, sent Bérenger a note as follows. "The purchase which we are to make will surely be made soon, but at a much better price. Thus there is no need of further funds." Bérenger was delighted. He had been gotten out of a pretty mess. He judged the pillars of the conspiracy to be weak reeds and had no faith in the chances of their harebrained plot. But Catherine, in the meantime, had turned to England to finance the purchase. 100,000 roubles were advanced by an English merchant, and now she was more than ever tied to Great Britain and hostile to France. The cabinet of Versailles was soon to recognize its mistake. "The sovereign, Catherine, will not forgive you for having abandoned her at such an interesting moment," Monsieur de Broglie would later write to Breteuil. In reality, despite all their feverish activity, Catherine's friends had no precise plan, no idea as to how, when the time came, they could bring her to the throne. With them it was all excitement, vagueness, and improvisation. Unaware of all this, Peter had left St. Petersburg on June the 12th, 1762, for his summer residence of Oranienbaum. He intended to rest there for a few days before joining his army in Pomerania. There he would hack the Danes to pieces and reconquer the precious Duchy of Schleswig. Unfortunately, the Russian fleet was not in condition to set sail. An epidemic had reduced the number of sailors. No matter. Peter signed a ukase ordering the sick to recover in the shortest possible time. Meantime, he caroused with his mistress and reviewed his troops. He paid no heed to his closest advisers, who told him how dangerous it was to desert the capital and the empire, leaving behind in St. Petersburg a cabal bent on ruining him. Nor would he listen to Frederick II, who advised him through his envoys Baron von Goltz and Count Schwerin that he should first have himself crowned in Moscow, that the Russians were too attached to formalities to respect a ruler who had not yet been consecrated by the Church, that a prudent monarch never launched upon a war until he had consolidated his rear. The only precaution that Peter agreed to was to order Catherine to move her residence from St. Petersburg to Peterhof, near Oranienbaum, on the Gulf of Finland. Catherine's friends suspected a trap, and she herself was anxious, but she did not want to draw back. She decided merely to leave alone, entrusting her son Paul to Panin's care. At Peterhof, where she arrived on June the 19th, she did not take up residence in the palace itself, but a little apart in the summer house at the water's edge called Mon Plaisir. There she waited to see what would happen, ready to welcome the emissaries of the Orloffs or to flee before her husband's henchmen. Peter had sent word that he would come to Peterhof on June the 29th to celebrate his name day, the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, and that she was to make ready to receive him. Would he not take advantage of the banquet to insult her again, or worse yet, to have her thrown into a fortress, as he had declared 100 times he intended to do? Informed of the forthcoming dangerous interview, Catherine's friends took counsel together, undecided and in the greatest anxiety. And then, on June the 27th, one of their number, Captain Pasek, was arrested. While drunk, and before witnesses, he had made insulting remarks about the Tsar. Under torture, he was likely to say more. The fuse had been lit. There was not a moment to lose. They must attack at all costs. In the middle of the night, Fyodor Orloff, Gregory's younger brother, hurried to the hetman Cyril Razumovsky, who was president of the Academy of Sciences and one of Catherine's strong supporters. Razumovsky had Taubert, the director of the Academy's printing works, roused from bed and asked him to print immediately a manifesto proclaiming that the Emperor Peter III had abdicated and that Catherine II had ascended the throne. This was madness. Not a single soldier had yet marched out of his barracks to support the Empress. The frightened Taubert equivocated, argued. But Razumovsky flung back at him, "You already know too much. Now your head, like mine, is at stake." Taubert, defeated, gave the order to compose the text. All that remained was to alert Catherine. Alexis Orloff took that task upon himself. 12. The coup d'etat. At dawn, on June the 28th, 1762, Alexis Orloff's carriage reached Peterhof. The still park seemed frozen in the milky light of the summer night. The silhouettes of a few Holstein guards floated like phantoms in the mist. Alexis avoided them and slipped stealthily through the bushes to the side door of the summer house, Mon Plaisir. As he swiftly crossed the dressing-room, he caught a glimpse of the court gown the Empress was to put on to welcome her husband. A moment later, the maid, Chargorodskaya, awoke Catherine from a deep sleep. Alexis Orloff was there, she said, and wished to speak to Her Majesty urgently. Catherine gathered her wits together in an instant. She received Alexis, sitting up in bed in her nightdress. He wore the look of a man armed for combat. "It's time to get up," he said. "Everything is ready to proclaim you Empress." Then he added, "Pasek has been arrested. We must go." This time Catherine had not the shadow of a hesitation. Her sense of timing was almost a sixth sense. She knew instinctively when to lie low and when to leap up. Already she was on her feet and dressing, without taking pains over her appearance. Chargorodskaya helped her with trembling hands. Hardly had the last button been fastened when the two women slipped out after Alexis to the waiting carriage. Catherine jumped in, her maid sat down beside her, the faithful valet Chekurin, whom they had awakened on the way, mounted behind with Lieutenant Bibikov. Alexis climbed up beside the driver, and the team set off at a gallop on the road to St. Petersburg. From time to time, Alexis looked back to see if they were being followed. For Catherine, the suddenness of this flight through the mist, the fresh air, the jolts of the carriage, the shouts of the driver, the fear of pursuit, the hope of success, all mingled together in a kind of joyous excitement. Suddenly she burst out laughing. She had noticed that her maid had lost a shoe, and that she herself was still wearing her lace nightcap. On the road they met Michel, Her Majesty's French coiffeur, coming to dress her hair, as he did each morning. They took him on board. He would run a comb through the Empress's hair in the carriage. The horses, which had already covered 30 versts to get to Peterhof, began to labour. One of them stumbled, fell, and got up with difficulty. Would they hold out all the way? In his haste, Alexis Orloff had neglected to arrange for relays. It made him furious to think that, through his fault, the great plan might end in catastrophe. But a peasant appeared, driving a wagon. Alexis and Jacurin stopped him and asked him to trade his fresh horses for their exhausted ones. The peasant agreed, and they galloped off again. A few versts from St. Petersburg, Prince Bariatinsky was waiting for Catherine with an open barouche. Quickly she changed carriages. Gregory was there too, on horseback. He had come to meet the fugitive. Seeing her lover so handsome and resolute, Catherine was exultant. He pranced alongside for a while, filled with pride as he escorted her on the road to glory, then clapped spurs to his horse and galloped ahead to announce the Empress's arrival to the Izmailovsky regiment. It was a little past 7 in the morning when the barouche drew up before the barracks. Drums rolled. With her heart pounding, Catherine advanced, frail and erect and in mourning dress, towards this mass of men on whom her fate depended. Standing in his stirrups, Gregory Orloff saluted her with his sword. She need not have been afraid. The soldiers were fired with enthusiasm. Besides, they had been promised the distribution of vodka. As soon as she appeared before them, there was disorder in the ranks, and a great cry broke from their rough faces, "Hurrah for our little mother, Catherine!" The chaplain of the regiment held up a cross. The officers surrounded the unfortunate Empress, who appealed to their courage to protect her. They knelt down, kissed the folds of her cloak. Count Cyril Razumovsky, commander of the regiment, likewise knelt before her. Then he stood up and demanded silence. Instead, the cheers of the troops redoubled. At last, dominating the joyous tumult, Cyril Razumovsky proclaimed Her Majesty the Empress Catherine sole and absolute sovereign of all the Russians, and, in the name of his soldiers, swore allegiance to her. On to the barracks of the Semyonovsky regiment. The priest led the line of march in sacerdotal robes, brandishing his cross. Around the Empress's open barouche rode Gregory Orloff, Cyril Razumovsky, and many other officers, their faces blazing with excitement. Behind them trotted a crowd of delighted, disorderly soldiers, shouting, "Long live our little mother, Catherine! We are ready to die for her." The Semyonovsky regiment enthusiastically joined the Izmailovsky regiment, and the swollen flood now rolled towards other barracks. Everywhere new troops merged with the old in an explosion of joy. With one exception, the Preobrazhensky regiment, whose officers the conspirators had not been able to subvert. Simon Vorontsov, the brother of the Empress's mistress, served as captain in this elite unit. In his mind, the cause of the Empire merged with his sister's cause. With the assistance of Major Voikov, he harangued the men, ordered them to respect the oath they had taken to the Tsar, and marched with them to meet the mutineers. The two groups confronted each other in front of the Cathedral of Kazan. The numerical superiority of Catherine's supporters was overwhelming, but they were a confused, disorderly crowd, and most of the soldiers were unarmed. Across the way, the Preobrazhensky regiment, completely outfitted and surrounded by their officers, gave the impression of a formidable bloc with discipline and the will to fight. Simon Vorontsov replied to Gregory Orloff's exhortations with a categorical refusal. Muskets were lowered. The fateful moment approached. If the loyal regiments opened fire, there would be almost certain panic in the throng around Catherine, headlong flight, pursuit, arrest, prison, death. Suddenly, Menshikov, chief adjutant of the Preobrazhensky regiment, shouted, "Hurrah! Long live the Empress!" After a second's hesitation, the cry was taken up in a chorus by his men. They broke ranks, rushed towards their comrades, embraced them, fell on their knees before Catherine, accused their officers of having deceived them. Boikov and Simon Vorontsov broke their swords and were arrested. Note: Catherine pardoned them later, but Vorontsov had to leave the army and, named ambassador to London, lived there in a sort of honorific exile. It was a clear summer's morning, cool and cloudless. The crowds were so dense on the Nevsky Prospect that, wide as it was, the avenue was completely blocked.